Welcome to Ecology. The objective today, students will be able to define ecology, the key terms involved within the science, explain food webs, ecological pyramids, and cycles of matter. So what is ecology? It's the study of interactions among organisms and the organisms within their environment. Another key term is biosphere. Biosphere is what's contained within the portion of the planet which life exists, including land, water, and air. Another key term, species. It's a group of organisms so similar to one another that they can breed. Populations are groups of individuals that belong to the same species and live in the same area, whereas communities are assemblages of different populations that live together in a defined area. Ecosystems are a collection of all organisms that live together in a particular place, as well as their non-living or physical environment. Finally, a biome is a group of ecosystems that have the same climate and similar dominant communities. Sunlight is the main source of all energy here on Earth. Autotrophs are organisms that produce simple compounds into more complex organic molecules. An example of this would be an apple tree. Autotrophs harness the power of the sun through photosynthesis to convert carbon dioxide, water, and oxygen into glucose. A second type of autotroph is bacteria that use chemical energy to make up their carbohydrates. Herbivores obtain energy by eating the autotrophs that got their energy from the sun. Likewise, heterotrophs rely on other organisms for their energy. Carnivores eat other animals. That's where they get their energy. Omnivores eat both plants and animals. This is an omnivore, a raccoon. They both eat plants and also other animals. And surprisingly enough, chickens eat insects and also plants. While detritivores feed on the remains of plants and animals and other dead stuff. Decomposers break down the dead stuff into organic matter. Let's go over feeding relationships. Energy flows through an ecosystem in only one direction, from the sun or inorganic compounds to autotrophs, and then to various heterotrophs, as you can see in this food chain. Corn goes to the mouse goes to the owl. It's as simple as that. A more complex way of looking at it is a food web. It shows the complex interactions within an ecosystem. Our red arrow is actually pointing towards our autotroph, which is then consumed by our primary consumer, the rabbit. Okay, and then you have a secondary consumer that actually eats the primary consumer, and then we have a tertiary consumer, and so on. Another way of looking at this is through an ecological pyramid, which is a diagram that shows the relationship of the amounts of energy and matter contained within each trophic level in a food web or a food chain. So we'll start out by looking at the very base level. This is where a lot of energy is consumed through the autotroph, and then on top of it we have our primary consumer, which is our groundhog. On top of that we have a secondary consumer, which is our coyote, and then finally we have our puma at the top of the pyramid. One of the key concepts to understand in our pyramid, our energy pyramid, is only 10% of the energy that's available at one level is passed on to the next. Now we'll take a look at the carbon cycle. Unlike one-way flows of energy, matter is recycled within nature. If we take a look at the carbon cycle, CO2 is produced by respiration and also combustion of fuels. This adds to the content of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, of course, photosynthesis by plants takes in the CO2 and makes sugars and, of course, carbon compounds within plants. But let's take a quick look and focus at the CO2 that's in our atmosphere. Where does that ultimately go? A lot is taken in by the oceans. CO2 is dissolved into the water of the oceans. And the problem with this is it turns into carbonic acid, and we've experienced a lot of problems within the oceans lately with our reef system. The reef system is actually dying because of the amount of carbonic acid that's being put into it through the CO2 in the atmosphere. And speaking about the atmosphere, let's go ahead and switch gears now into the nitrogen cycle. As you know, 78% of the atmosphere is made up of N2, it's nitrogen gas. There are several steps, though, that nitrogen needs to go through in order for us to be able to utilize the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere. And of course, nitrogen is very important to all living organisms because, of course, nitrogen base pairs are a main component of DNA, and all living things need DNA. and all things need DNA in order to mass produce their cells. So, but there's several different steps that need to go through the nitrogen cycle before human beings can use the nitrogen. So as we look at the nitrogen cycle, our second stop here is with plants, and plants actually uptake nitrogen via the root system, and they assimilate the nitrogen into their DNA. So they're taking something that is inorganic and making it organic. And as our green arrow turns into sort of a brownish color arrow, it represents the consumption of plants by animals. And of course, animals can take apart the plants, and they can actually take the pieces and parts of the plant, including the nitrogen base pairs, and then reassemble them into their own DNA. This is very similar to, if you've ever played with Legos, you can take apart a Lego car and make a Lego house, and you can take a Lego house and take it apart and make a rocket ship. Well, you know, when you're eating a tomato, you're taking apart the pieces and parts of that tomato and then rebuilding using those nitrogen base pairs and all the different components and making cells that make up you. And then of course we have the dead organic matter that then is converted into NH3, and then we have nitrification, NO2 negative, and bacteria actually goes through oxidation, which is changing it into a nitrate ion, and then the plants can uptake the nitrogen once again, and the process completely goes over and over again. We also have a phosphorus cycle, which begins with rocks that have phosphorus, and then we have runoff, which involves lakes and streams. Plants uptake the phosphorus and actually use it within their metabolism, and of course ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the key component there is the phosphate, and that's used for energy.